Here we are, together, at the end of a very strange semester. It's always a little strange to be in these summer semesters. They're very short. You can feel that everything's kind of crammed together into this shortened amount of time, but we're supposed to pretend as if it's the same. But that doesn't begin to speak about what was strange about our experience here. In the spring, many of you were forced to leave campus in a rush and without due notice, perhaps being forced to return to another part of the world or another part of the country. Massive protests rocked this country and many others in the world after the horrifying murder of George Floyd and the story of what happened to Breonna Taylor. I don't know how you felt during this, except for what some of you have said during your videos, but I know I had many feelings that I wish that we could have talked more about in this semester. And now I do wonder why I did not feel free to change what was happening, to talk about that directly with you. There's always a difficulty in balancing the various things that we have to do, the various concerns that we have. But I think we should always begin with what are common concerns. This doesn't necessarily mean always beginning with what is everyone agrees upon, nor does it mean beginning with the most important, serious, grave topics. We often hear when we go to a public speaking class or business speaking class a tip that people commonly give. Say something interesting at the beginning of your speech. As a tip, I don't find this to be very provocative. I don't find it to be very useful even. Well, what makes something interesting? If I could say something interesting to my audience, of course I would want to say something interesting. But what does it actually mean to interest an audience? I think if we look a little bit at that word, we get a sense of the grander significance that might have. It comes from the Latin interessa, which means being between. What interests us can never be what only interests us as an individual. It is always something that is between us and the world. Sometimes what is between us is a barrier. Racial injustice, economic inequality, contagion. All of these things might be between us, and we wouldn't necessarily say, I'm interested in that, but it is something that interests us and that we're invested in it, not necessarily in its continuation. We may be invested in its removal or abolition, but we're invested in it as something that concerns us. And in that sense, it is a common concern. So I think this broad spectrum, if we think about the broad spectrum of what it means to speak to someone, can be captured by that idea of common concern. Everything that is interesting is part of common concern, but also everything that interests us, everything that is about us, which might not always be present to us in the moment that we sit down to listen to someone speak, to read something that someone wrote, or perhaps to attend to an image that someone has produced. So all of the things that stand between us are not all barriers. The things that are between us are also what make saying us possible. These are negotiated, mediated, and oftentimes brought into existence through symbol systems, through speech, language, gesture, emotion, but they are fundamentally symbolic things. My interest in justice, my interest in health, my interest in equality. I can't conceive of these as something distinct from the possibility of the symbolic unification of all of the different instances of what they may mean. And when it comes down to specific instances, we may disagree, we may argue, and that's part of what's happening in our common concerns. It's a negotiation of what things mean, how should we interpret them, and how should we respond to them. I hope this class gives you a few techniques to think about how to bring things into common concern. And so when you hear someone say, interest your audience, or say something interesting, know that it's more than a funny one-liner or something that is a joke that you just heard that works. To truly interest your audience is an impossible task to master, because it means that one has to be in the concerns of your audience just as fully as you're in your own private concerns.